Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and you can see out on the bench I've already got my 3 yellow buckets with the European night crawlers in them. These systems are now 222 days old and we've gotten into the habit of visiting them every 2 weeks. Every 14 days they get fed, and today they're due for a feeding. And this will be feeding number 17. Most of the time when you reach 222 days of age and exceed 15, and at this point if you're getting your 17th feeding, in my wormery usually means it's time to end, but as you can see in these containers, there's lots and lots of room remaining. But we might end these systems soon. I've been thinking it'd be nice to get into a little bit less cramped quarters to make it easier to film, so either way, we're going to be giving them some coffee and some worm chow, one of those boring feedings. So I'm going to put on a glove and we'll get to work. In my systems, it's become customary to use coffee filters as our so-called feeding zone indicators to show us where we last fed. The last time we fed these systems, they received melon, mostly watermelon, a couple pieces of cantaloupe melon. And I think just because of the darker appearance of the material on this side, and also because I can see a slope, I'm not sure if it's visible from that perspective of the camera, but there's no sign of the coffee filter that was placed in here, or what remained of the coffee filter. It was just, shreds of the coffee filter anymore. The system's none of these systems have received coffee for some time, so I'm glad that we're feeding with coffee today so we can give these systems brand new feeding zone indicators. Because in the case of this system, at least, we can see that the feeding zone indicator has been eaten up. Usually a pretty good sign that we're probably in need of bedding, some more carbon-based foods for them since they're coming up and gobbling up the coffee filter. These are just pieces of what I believe to be a banana peel stem, basically. So I always like to check how things worked out down in the last feeding area, which would have been this side, I'm assuming, at this point. From the watermelon and cantaloupe, I had assumed we'd have pretty damp stuff over here, and that's exactly what I'm seeing. Very muddy stuff. I was hoping that we wouldn't go that way because, I don't know, in a system like this where there's so much sidewall, I don't think there's a lot of airflow, and because of that, I think the moisture remains down in the system like this for a lot longer, unable to kind of waft away and evaporate as easily as a more open tray. Hopefully we haven't created a dampening situation that might lead to clumping or other problems. I think one of the new priorities here is going to now be to get this stuff to dry a little bit. Good thing we're feeding with only coffee today and some of my worm chow. Virtually no moisture is introduced with that type of a feeding. The main reason I'm digging this feeding zone up so much is because I was not only interested in seeing how the bedding on the surface did by, highlighting what happened with the feeding zone indicator, how they ate it. I was also curious of the very large napkin I had placed right below the feeding area. I wonder if there'd be any leftovers of that. And I don't see anything. It was a pretty vivid colored yellow napkin. And if there were leftovers of it, I think we'd see at least little scraps of it, but I haven't seen anything that resembles it. I think that tells us the system probably could use some bedding. And that was the only ingredient that I haven't really accounted for because I wasn't quite sure of the need. But I am starting to get the sense that bedding would be a good thing to give them, and maybe more than just a napkin here. It's a good thing that I kind of went off onto a little busy bee streak lately, because first I went ahead and I prepared a whole bunch of eggshell into grit. I basically ran out of the space that I had in the jar where I'd always put the eggshells. I keep crushing them and pushing them down and trying to crush them even further to fit more, and couldn't fit any more eggshells into my jar, and that told me it was time to pulverize. So I made grit, and then the following day I made bedding, got my shredder out, made a whole bunch of bedding, and then finally I was running low on worm chow too, so I got the grinder out and made a whole bunch of worm chow too. So I'm restocked on all my supplies. So I can go any way I want, and I'm thinking we might want to go bedding rich. And dry food will be a plus too, to maybe help with drying in here a little bit. So let me go get the bedding, and we'll get these guys fed. Well, since the yellow napkins were such a hit last time, guess what? I have more. So I've got my prepared shredded paper, shredded cardboard, and leaf mix. And we'll throw some of that in here too, just to make it a little bit more rich in bedding for them. And I got a feeling that they're just going to go ahead and do away with all of it. And guess what? They're even going to be getting a brand new replacement coffee filter as their feeding zone indicator. So let's grab one of these little meal packages. And I guess we can drop in perhaps half of it. And then we'll, I gotta know where to put stuff. There we go. We'll dress it up a little bit with some worm chow. It's kind of hard to finesse the application of it because the jar is so full, it's just kind of wanting to spill out. So let's give them a little bit more. This is the new batch of worm chow. Not very different from the last batch, except for one new ingredient I included, and it's not so much for the nourishment value, but for the anti-clumping feature, I guess. It's diatomaceous earth. So I actually went ahead and I included diatomaceous earth in this feeding, and it's because of what I heard on the World Composting Channel, how it's right there on the packaging of what that guy Newell uses for his diatomaceous earth. It makes reference to how it's got this anti-clumping, declumping kind of capability too, which I didn't even know it could do, and it worked great because one of my ingredients is nuts, and they become almost like a peanut butter, and by using that it helps that stuff kind of, you know, blend in better with all the other stuff that shreds fine. And we're also gonna drop in, oh, that's a lot, I don't know, I wonder what they'll do with it. Hopefully they'll eat it. So yep, that's all my shredded prepared bedding. Like I said, shredded paper, shredded cardboard, and little fragments of leaves. I include a little bit of moisture in there too, and it's a pretty nice mix. So how about a little more worm chow? I've got plenty of it. Alright, definitely like the way the stuff is less clumpy now, because it did used to form into these little clumps and chunks, and this way it feels like it's a lot more powdery, which is kind of cool. I like it. Hopefully the worms do too. Alright, well, before we cover up our feeding area and indicate it with the feeding zone, I guess we'll start spreading some of this material back down. I can see a number of cocoons over here. I don't know, I guess maybe they're not feeling as cramped as I am in here. It does seem from a worm density perspective there might still be a little bit more room in here. But then I also wonder if they sense the absence of fresh bedding and food and stuff, and maybe sense what they're living in as being nearly depleted. I wonder if that influences their reproductive patterns or behaviors. So now we've got ourselves a nice brand new indicator to show ourselves where we last fed, and lots of bedding on this one. So sometimes I take a little bit longer doing the first of the three, but now that we kind of invented how this visit should look, and since we are interested in maintaining some consistency between the systems, we'll just to the best of our ability at least try to mimic what we just did here in bucket number 2, and see if we could pick up the pace. Okay, here too I could see fresh castings appearing to have accumulated on the side that slopes down. I could see a cocoon right there, I believe. I don't know, the lighting's a little difficult for me to see. Usually I could lighten things up to make it result in a nicer, cleaner, easier to see video in the end after I edit stuff, but here in real life it's not quite as easy to see sometimes. This looks like newspaper. Although I'm not sure newspaper was really part of the last feeding. Maybe newspaper got blended in a couple feedings ago. Just unusual that it like survived, you know, a chunk that large. You would think that it would have all been consumed, because once again down here I'm seeing no signs of the melon, which is no surprise after 14 days, but also no signs of any of the yellow napkin they'd been given last time. The material luckily in here doesn't feel quite as damp. It feels just a little bit more crumbly and loose, but still maybe a little bit more damp than I would like it to be. You know, this thing sort of rings a bell, because I did skim through the video from last time, and I did make reference to a strand-like object, which might have been this here, and it might be a piece of, like, I don't know, artificial material, because it's not going anywhere. It's not breaking down. If it was like a human hair or something, I guess it would have probably deteriorated, because they say you can compost human hair and fingernails and stuff like that, but that thing just has not changed. Every time I bump into it, it's totally intact. That's what's left of our coffee filter, feeding zone indicator. Not much. We'll just recycle it, make bedding out of it, and we'll drop in their new feeding on this side. I'm even wondering if in bucket number 1 we might, well, okay, no, we're counting backwards, aren't we? Bucket number, no, we just did bucket number 1. Yeah, I'm doing them in order. Maybe bucket 1 would benefit from me just removing the cardboard covering. I wonder if letting it air out would, you know, maybe result in a little bit less dampness. Maybe all of them would. I've been uncovering a lot of my systems because it's the hot and humid summer here in New Jersey. And there's certainly not a lot of danger of stuff drying out due to evaporation. There's already just such moisture in the air. Things do dry rather slowly relative to other times of the year. For example, when the furnace is running constantly in the winter, I find the air in my house to be very dry. Quite the opposite right now. Let me go get them another yellow napkin. We can get these guys fed. I'm not sure it's visible. Let me tip the bucket. Can I tip it to show it? Oh, there it is. It's over here, a little wormy, climbing the wall. Get off the wall, buddy. Get back down into the material. That's where you'll be safe. So, besides fetching the yellow napkin here, I couldn't resist just going back to bucket 1, removing the cardboard, and we'll just leave all the cardboards off at this point, assuming that that's what bin number 3 or bucket number 3 is going to need also. It's just what I'm guessing. So, in with feeding number 2 for bucket number 2. Pretty much the same deal. We'll throw in about half of this allotment of coffee that they're getting. Combine it with worm chow. The one thing I do notice, though, is the little splinters of the sunflower seeds. Those are somehow a little more difficult to grind up. It does seem like they leave little thin splinters. The material breaks down super quick once it's in the worm bin. It just results in material that doesn't look quite as powdery because it's got these little filaments in it. But I like the way this stuff flows. It's a lot more loose, and I like it that way. So, one more handful of my prepared bedding. Pretty generous handful once again. Yeah, I think they're going to appreciate that. So, you know what? Let's change the order a little bit. Let's throw a little bit of worm chow right into that paper. And then now top it with the coffee instead. Usually I do it the other way. We'll add more worm chow anyway. I feel generous now that I've got a nice replenished supply. So how about that? That should definitely bring the worms over. I mean, there was nothing as far as leftovers are concerned in this system, so it does seem to me like we probably got ourselves a whole bunch of hungry little wormies. If nothing else, I'm sure they're enjoying the moisture in the system. Luckily, this one is just not quite as damp as the first one was. The first one is the one where I really feel leaving it uncovered is the way to go. Here, I could have gone either way, I believe. But once again, we are attempting to run them very similarly, if not identical, to one another. So we're doing it in the name of consistency. All right. On to the finish line. Bucket number 3. All right. I'm assuming we're going to encounter a very similar deal. Here, too, they were given melon, which probably would have brought with it a good bit of moisture. Here, too, I'm assuming we're not going to see any yellow napkin, but we are actually seeing a pretty good bit of coffee filter. I just can't remember if one of the systems, maybe this one, did get upgraded with a replacement one of these pretty recently. Maybe that's the only reason that we can account for its pretty large size from being a leftover. Curious, let's see if we could find any yellow napkin. Definitely finding moisture as we kind of expected that we would. I guess we're seeing some cantaloupe rind left over as well. Something we didn't see in the other two systems. The other two systems were definitely also given cantaloupe alongside the watermelon. I mean, just from a general worm density observation, I think we have a similar number of worms in here, or at least that's the way it would appear to me. But I'm never really that good at that. That's why I always seek the input of my viewers to hear what they say in terms of their estimates for worm populations. I'm once again feeling moisture in here is probably a little bit more than is needed. Although I'm sure you're not going to catch any worms complaining about it. I'm sure they love it. But there will come a day, probably not too far down the road, when we'll wish for this stuff to be a lot drier. So we'll give them the same recipe that the other bins got, which I hope is going to have the recipe for success built into it with, you know, paper material that probably still has some capability of absorbing moisture, giving them foods that within themselves don't have a lot of moisture content to it. The dry worm chow, the coffee, even the big, yellow napkin that goes in the beginning is like a big sponge too, hopefully sucking up some of this moisture. So let me grab the yellow napkin for these guys, and we'll get these guys fed too. Whoa, there it goes. Avalanche had to happen. So it's interesting. I figured I'd grab my little stick here. I was actually going to point at something resting right there. But there's one here too. You can see there's a cocoon. It's kind of like a shiny little globe, almost like a little. There's one here. I mean, they're scattered all over the place. But I just got distracted by that little worm avalanche going on over there. So we've got ourselves yellow napkin number 3 for bin number 3, getting its boring feeding of coffee, and we'll dispense with it in much the same way as we did the other systems. That makes me wonder, how is it that we've got leftover coffee filter feeding zone indicator in this system, while it seems like we've got pretty much a comparable, if not almost identical looking worm population in here. I've never really allowed myself to try to pick one or the other of these systems as being deficient or lacking, or even, I don't know, I think in the beginning we did sort of try to figure out if there was one that was sort of behind, and I don't know if it was this one or not. I tried my best just to always treat them equally, not try to scale back feeding sizes or anything to try to account for anything. And it does seem to me like we're kind of at that point where I see no real visible difference in terms of worm numbers. It seems like we've got just as popular and populous a worm bucket here as we do in the other systems. But I could be completely wrong. I'm wondering if people would agree or disagree with me on that observation. It's true that I have kind of a weird perspective here, because I guess once I reach my arm in, I'm almost blocking my own view, because it's almost like either my line of sight gets in there or my my arm, but having both at the same time is usually not easily achieved. So I don't know. I think we've got ourselves yet another pretty nice feeding zone in here with, I don't know, for whatever reason, a feeding that I sometimes classify, perhaps just because of its boring color scheme, a boring feeding with the coffee and worm chow, and I guess the yellow napkin brought the color splash to the video to match the yellow buckets. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.